Hello. We're going to wrap up today with Revolution and Civil War in Mexico and then talk about the global impact of imperialism. Upon independence in 1821, Mexican society was deeply divided. A few wealthy families of Spanish origin owned 85% of the land, while the majority of Amerindians and mestizos were poor peasants. Concentration of land ownership increased after independence as wealthy families and American companies used bribery and force to acquire millions of acres of good agricultural land, forcing peasants into wage labor and ultimately debt. In 1910, General Porfirio Diaz had ruled for 34 years. Diaz's policies had made Mexico City a modernized showplace and brought wealth to a small number of businessmen. But his rule was also characterized by discrimination against the non-white majority of Mexicans, a decline in the average Mexican standard of living, as well as the denial of basic rights. The Mexican Revolution was a social revolution and not the work of one party with a well-defined ideology. It developed haphazardly, led by a series of ambitious but very limited number of men, each representing a different segment of Mexican society. Francisco Madero overthrew Diaz in 1911. He was only able to rule for 2 years, though, because he was then overthrown himself by General Huerta in 1913. The Constitutionalists were the third faction in the Mexican Revolution. They consisted of mainly middle-class urbanites, liberals, and intellectuals who desired a constitution under the guideline Mexico for Mexicans. After the series of revolutions, they would dominate Mexican politics as the PRI until the late 1970s. Francisco Madero overthrew Diaz in 1911, like I said, overthrown by General Huerta in 1913. And then the Constitutionalists began to rise up. The Constitutionalists Carranza and Obregón emerged as leaders of the disaffected middle class and industrial workers. They organized armies that overthrew Huerta in 1914. Mexico established a new constitution in 1917. It protected the property rights of the elite, but it also promised that land ownership was a privilege of the nation. Carranza was responsible for this constitution. He was not in power long enough to enact its changes, and in the 1920 election, in which he could not succeed himself, he attempted to impose a virtually unknown civilian politician named Ignacio Bonias as president of Mexico. But Carranza was assassinated before the actual election. Obregón was elected in 1920 and ruled until 1924. He tried to stabilize the country by implementing social clauses of the Constitution. Mexico gained stability in 1929, 20 years after the revolution. However, the land reforms and workers' rights were not fully implemented. And a reason for that is Obregón attempted to run again, and before he could take office, he was assassinated in 1928. Emilio Zapata and Francisco or Pancho Villa were two men who led peasant revolts. Zapata led a peasant revolt in Morelos, south of Mexico City, and Pancho Villa organized an army in northern Mexico. But neither man was able to rise above his regional and peasant origins to lead a national revolution, and Zapata was defeated and killed by the Constitutionalists in 1919. Villa was assassinated in 1923. The Constitutionalists took over Mexico after years of fighting, an estimated 2 million casualties and tremendous damage. In the process, the Constitutionalists adopted many of their rivals' agrarian reforms and proposed a number of social programs designed to appeal to workers and the middle class. The Mexican Revolution lost momentum in the 1920s, with few of the proposed reforms ever actually enacted. And here's Mexico in the early 20th century. So pause if you need, take a look. Notice the dates and locations of certain events. Very important. The Industrial Revolution greatly expanded the demand for spices, silk, agricultural goods, and raw materials in the industrialized countries. The growing need for these products could not be met by traditional methods of production and transportation. So the imperialists brought their colonies into the mainstream of the world market and introduced new technologies. One dramatic result of colonization was rapid environmental change, as farms and plantations replaced forests and traditional agricultural zones. During this time period, Britain was more interested in trade than in acquiring territory, probably because they had the largest colonial empire in the world. They had territory in Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia. Just throwing that out there for you guys. Most of the new colonies were intended to serve as ports in a global shipping network that the British envisioned in terms of free trade, as opposed to the previous mercantilist trade policy. However, some of their colonies, such as Egypt and India, were only actually allowed to send their goods to Great Britain. And they were not allowed to trade with certain people. So, you can draw your own conclusions. Anyway, whether colonized or not, more lands were being drawn into the commercial networks created by the British expansion and industrialization. These areas became exports of raw materials and agricultural goods and importers of affordable manufactured products. And we'll talk about why later down the road in Unit 6, this becomes a very large problem. In addition, between 1834 and 1870, large numbers of Indians, Chinese, and Africans went overseas as laborers. British India was the greatest source of migrant laborers, and British colonies, particularly sugar plantations, were the principal destination of the migrants. With the end of slavery, the demand for cheap labor in the British colonies, Cuba and Hawaii, was filled by Indians, free Africans, Chinese, and Japanese workers. These workers served under contracts of indenture that bound them to work for a specified number of years in return for free passage to their overseas destination, a small salary, and free housing, clothing, and medical care. These newly indentured labor trade reflected the economic and industrial dominance of the West. But it was not entirely a one-way street. These migrants were trying to improve their lives, and many of them succeeded. But what's important to remember is that the life that was promised to a number of these people who came over on the indentured contract wasn't what they were expecting, and they were not treated well at all. Wrapping it up and bringing it home, guys. So just a quick summary. What stands out in this period is not just the military and political strength of Europe and the US, but their domination of global commerce as they moved into Southeast Asia and Africa for a variety of economic reasons. And these instances of imperialism will have tragic and drastic consequences, both short-term and long-term. And yes, we will be discussing every single one of them. These colonial exchanges could be mutually beneficial in some ways. Consumers gained access to cheaper manufactured goods, and African and Asian resources reached the global market. These interactions could be profoundly disruptive, more so as they produced significant environmental change. They undermined local small-scale manufacturers and quite often created an environment of racism, an environment of disrespect, and in many cases, environments of death, and in the case of the Congo, genocide. The rest of the world was not simply an appendage to the West. Local cultures remained vibrant, and mainly in Asia and Latin America retained control of what would be their own destinies. All right, you know the drill. If you have a question, send me an email. Otherwise, review your notes, get ready for the quiz that we'll be having. Come prepared to ask questions. Discuss. Academic discourse, guys. Think about it, and have a great night. Cheers!